Gentleman from 14.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the roll call used for the suspension of rules on House Bill 245 now be used for the suspension of rules on House Bill 195, making possible the immediate consideration of House Bill 195.
You've heard the unanimous consent request. Is there an objection? Hearing none, then the roll call of 66 aye, 0 nay, and 4 absent used on the suspension of rules on House Bill 245 will now be used for the suspension of rules on House Bill 195, making possible immediate consideration of House Bill 195. Good gentleman from District 10, or good lady from District 18.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask for unanimous consent to dispense with further reading of House Bill 195.
Without objection, the lady has the floor to begin the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I want to take just a quick moment and shift the narrative a little bit. The narrative that has been unfolding on the media for the last couple weeks. Primarily the narrative that goes to speak about this very bill and how it is nothing more than a protection for us, elected officials. I want to revert back to why this bill is before you today. Our law enforcement community, our public servants who leave every day for their shifts, not knowing if they're going to come home. This bill, House Bill 195, is an added protection for them. This past summer, we watched while one of our law enforcement community members, their family, was held hostage in their home because they simply did their job. Somebody doxed their address, encouraged people to go stand outside their home while their family was inside, while their children were inside, because they simply didn't like how their job was done. This bill is an added protection to one of our finest community servants, our law enforcement officers. As many of you in the past couple of weeks may have received, hopefully you read the letters from several of the spouses who wrote to you, and hopefully you took what they had to say to heart. Because I get to stand with them. I get to stand with all the other spouses of law enforcement officers who every day we get to watch them leave, see if they come home, and pray for their safety. That's a privilege that I get to take part in because of all the other spouses who stand by their husbands for simply doing their job. There's a risk we all know. We didn't all sign up to it, and many of us did sign on to it. But what we hadn't signed on to is what is unfolding not only here in Idaho, but across the United States. Because there are certain segments of our society, because of whatever social fabric that they adhere to, find it okay to show up in front of our law enforcement families and terrorize them on their doorstep. I know what you're thinking, because they're not held captive. They can simply go somewhere else. But should they? Shouldn't they be allowed to go home like the rest of us and find comfort in their homes and with their families? Or should we expect them to keep their head on the swivel once they get home, that they cannot find rest and comfort in their home, where they tuck their kids into bed? Should the new normal be the fact that they should expect somebody outside of their home protesting them for what they did? Because this is the reality. This is what's unfolding across the United States and unfortunately unfolded here in Idaho. I know what you're going to say. There's already stuff on the books to cover this, to protect us, the existing laws. If that's the case, don't you think the Brothers in Blue would have provided and used those tools to address what was unfolding in that law enforcement's home? Don't you think they would have leveraged the existing laws to protect one of their own? If existing laws were sufficient, why would we have the support of the Fraternal Order of Police, the Chief of Police, the Sheriff's Association, the prosecutors? Because our law enforcement community is asking us for more teeth to be able to do their job. Our law enforcement community and their spouses are asking for a little bit more protection to enable them to go home and rest in comfort in their home. Not passing this, we are all jointly agreeing that this behavior is okay, that our law enforcement families shouldn't have this additional protection, that this tactic is okay. But I want to reiterate, this isn't the first time in Idaho that we have actually addressed speech. In 2007, we passed an added disturbing the peace statute, a misdemeanor. That was passed because of the malicious behavior that was occurring in front of soldiers' funerals. in 2006. And you know what we did in 2007 in that session? We acted accordingly. We added to disturbing the peace so we could protect our funerals of our soldiers. We're not stirring the hornet's nest by addressing this, because guess what, guys? It's already out. This is already a new playbook. Both ends, for two fringes, is using this playbook, not only here in Idaho, but across the United States. And they're using it to terrorize our families. So this isn't a protection just about elected officials, as what played out in the media. This is adding another protection to those who serve our community and who leave their homes every day and should be able to come home to the comfort of their homes and not expect somebody on their doorstep for simply doing their job. I'm going to cede the rest of my time to the gentleman from District 10, who's going to certainly discuss the constitutionality of this and open it up for our lively debate, which is to unfold.
Thank you. Does the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yields.
The gentleman has the floor to continue the opening debate.
Thank you, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The committee discussion on this bill was characterized by one member of the media as one of the most reflective and thoughtful debates they had heard in years of covering the State House, and I have no question that we will live up to that standard here today with our varying points of view on this very difficult topic. Remember the first time I saw this particular tactic employed. It was at least 4 years ago, maybe 5 now, and it was against a member of this body at his home over a gun bill. And I bring that up for 2 reasons. One is that didn't spur me on to any action. It was unfortunate to see, but it did not cause me to sponsor or draft legislation. What did was the specter of the Meridian police officer's home and the invasion of that bubble of safety that officer left for his shift and presumed to exist. Secondly, it's happening more frequently. Like I said, the first time that I observed this was several years ago, and it was several years until it happened again. But from coast to coast, you see this practice happening more and more and more. I just emailed the body an article from the state of Missouri. Senator Josh Hawley, who along with Senator Ted Cruz led the challenge to the certification of the election in the Senate, his home was approached by protesters, and a similar law in the state of Missouri was invoked to protect his family. Since introducing this legislation, I've seen additional people come forward and express that this sort of thing had happened to them. Members of law enforcement, even a high school friend that I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, contacted me to let me know that this had just happened to one of his officers on the force that he's on the East Coast. There are social media posts declaring that this should be the way, that not just the right or not just the left, but the way to interact with public officials. This bill is about 2 things, and the primary one is protecting our law enforcement. Again, when it was just one of us, that wasn't enough to spur me to action. But number 2, it's also about giving the majorities who elected each of us their proper place in policymaking. Far too much has been made of the fact that this, after introducing this bill, this happened to me. I'd like you to set that aside to the degree you can, because this bill isn't about me. After that happened, several of you came to me with offers to swing by the house, or comments that you had long driveways, mean dogs, spouses who were accurate shots, that sort of thing. But I want you to set that aside as well, because it's really not about you either, irrespective of your kindness. And I also want to be clear that what I am vilifying today is a technique. It is a behavior, it is an action and I'm criticizing its place in our discourse. I am not intending to vilify the people behind it. I did attempt in my committee discussion to present the place in history for confrontational politics when it got out of control. But even then, it was not my desire or intention to vilify individuals. Mr. Speaker, if I were to call you up and I were to emphatically yell, "I know where you live," that would be universally recognized as a threat in that context. But if I showed up to prove it, how is that not a threat? This tactic is an intimidation technique, no matter how it's used. Imagine our law enforcement leaving their spouse and children asleep in the house and then just going about their shift like there's nothing wrong with protesters out on the street in front of their house. Imagine a use of force situation, be it justified or unjustified, where it's the crowd and not the facts or the courts that determine how much grief that officer is going to face. Our discourse, political discourse, should be shaped by argumentation and the will of the majorities of those who elected us, who entrusted each one of us with the responsibility to come here to this body. And each one of us have shown that we are worthy of that trust, and each one of us are people who do what we say we're going to do. And while we must always show respect for the minority points of view, any tactic that seeks to, by fear or intimidation, displace the majority of the citizenry in policy making is inherently undemocratic and incompatible with a constitutional republic. Those employing this on the left and the right, and by the way, both are active in Idaho, although it's more common in a conservative state for the right to be more active and more common in the liberal states for the left to be more active, but both are active. These are small groups seeking their policy aims over the preferences of the silent majority. We heard repeatedly that people weren't being heard, but Mr. Speaker, there is a difference between being heard and being followed. Each one of us on a daily basis here is heard, and each one of us at some point in the day isn't followed. But we have been elected by a majority, and we have a duty to them. John Adams stated that there can be no public virtue without private virtue. There seems to be a new politic, as the good lady expressed in her opening. Even expressions that those who disagree, irrespective of their vote count, should resign rather than put up with the irritations that are brought upon them. We have a way to displace elected officials. It's the ballot box. And when a small fringe minority seeks to displace the majority, that is undemocratic. Don't betray the people who elected you in favor of those who bully you. This is about protecting people. And far more than you and I, Mr. Speaker, or any other elected official, this is about the police, the judges, the prosecuting attorneys, the wrongly accused. Imagine, if you will, Christopher Tapp. We have discussed his tragic case in this body 2 years in a row. Imagine if the confession that was ultimately thrown out, leading to his exoneration, had been thrown out at trial instead of years after the fact. On its face, that sounds like a beautiful thing, but what if the community was not convinced of his innocence at that point, and they began to case him and essentially harass him with their presence and with their messaging to the point of tragedy? In our social media age, it's not uncommon to hear somebody who's been so viciously attacked that they've either committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide. But the answer to that is, well, just shut off your phone or shut off the computer. Do something else, read a book. But if you're already at home, where else are you supposed to go? I've heard from business owners who had disgruntled employees outside their home that they couldn't do anything about because it was considered picketing. I've heard from law enforcement families long since retired who say that their adult daughter still suffers from PTSD from some of the similar behaviors years ago. And they didn't find out about it until they were discussing this bill with them. Your voters and our law enforcement need you to stand in the gap and redirect the conversation to these halls. Choose the people that are protecting you over the people who are bullying you. Now, I want to address some of the myths that have come about the legality of this bill. First of all, that is currently covered in law, specifically the Disturbing the Peace statute. Mr. Speaker, there's a packet of information with a jury instruction on the front of it in cardstock. And the back piece of paper to that packet has 2 case excerpts. The one that is State v. Poe, 2004. It cites to a case I'll go over in a moment at the Supreme Court level. But it specifically says that our Disturbing the Peace statute, all of it, not just the section that Poe struck down as unenforceable, which Poe did strike it down, but none of it is sufficiently narrowly tailored to allow to be used for this specific purpose. I've been asked if we could make it more narrow as far as who it covers, and I've researched that in earnest. I've also been asked if we could make it fit into the current Disturbing the Peace statute, and I've researched that in earnest. Neither option would stand the constitutional test. Additionally, the other side of that piece of paper, Mr. Speaker, shows an excerpt from Frisbee v. Schultz, 1988. The second myth is that this is unconstitutional, but this is an opinion crafted by Reagan appointee Sandra Day O'Connor and joined in by Justice Scalia, upholding a very similar ordinance. And in this decision, Justice O'Connor notes that while there are many places to protest, there's only one place to retreat to be home, and that there are legitimate conflicting interests here. I've also heard that it's bad timing. It's like that old issue of, well, you can't fix the roof when it's raining, and when it's not raining, the roof don't need fixing. This practice, look it up as we're debating this practice is on the rise nationwide, specifically targeting law enforcement above all others. Confrontational politics that has gone unchecked has never self-corrected without things getting far worse. I've heard that perhaps we should talk to these folks and figure out what's going on. Well, which side, which extreme, the left or the right, or both? Because people have tried across the spectrum, and nonetheless, we're told that they don't have a forum and they haven't been heard. I've been told that this is a novel approach. Utah is considering a statute in their legislature right now. Salt Lake City has had an ordinance on the books for a couple of years. I just mentioned the Hawley article I emailed everybody in Missouri. Georgia and Colorado also have their own ordinances. And in that same packet I just referenced, there's a copy of the Arizona statute. And you'll notice that the language of the Arizona statute and the language of House Bill 195 are eerily similar. And the reason for that is because the Arizona statute has been on the books since 1989. They are a fellow Ninth Circuit state. They're a fellow Republican legislature at the time. And on its only appeal in 1995, it was upheld. So this identical language has been upheld as constitutional for 25 years. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel and get too creative. That's why we defended this particular language. I also heard that some of what's going on is justified. But I'd ask you to separate yourself from the reasons behind the protest, because I guarantee you for every reason that you might agree with, there's 100 reasons that you would disagree with as justifying this sort of an invasion. In fact, a lot of the testimony we heard included averments that it was a justifiable practice. In fact, the person whose arrest occasioned the protest at the Meridian officer's home testified in committee. And the testimony centered on the wrongfulness of the arrest. Essentially, that they had it coming. Don't judge the behavior by the policy aims. We've seen in Portland and Seattle how our left-leaning friends have trouble standing up to their left-leaning extremists. I know that this body won't have the same difficulty just because we also are including right-wing extremists. Antifa, BLM, and People's Rights are all using the same approach. That's why it's important that this is bipartisan. Now, online, Mr. Speaker, online you see a lot of comments about, well, it's justified because of X, or this is horrible behavior because of Y. I just mentioned Seattle and Portland as examples of that. Many conservatives were outraged at the autonomous zone that was permitted in Seattle and by what we would describe as lawlessness on the streets of Portland. Similarly, there are, sadly, examples to be pointed at from the left to the right. And while social media rages on with examples of it's okay when it's for a cause I agree with, but it's not okay when it's for a cause I disagree with, in this body, the hypocrisy of politics gives way to the courage of statesmanship. Mr. Speaker, what our prosecuting attorneys, what our judges, what our law enforcement do on a daily basis is not easy, and it's not safe. And I know that if you were to ask any of us in here point blank if you support law enforcement, we would say yes. We are in a culture where this specific practice is increasing, but also disrespect for law enforcement from the left and the right is increasing. Those who have sworn to support law enforcement have at times failed in that regard. There was a microcosm that captures that, unfortunately, in January when we saw a thin blue line flag pole used to injure a Capitol Hill police officer. This is an example of our words not being enough. Mr. Speaker, I ask for your green light and I ask for your support for our law enforcement families. Thank you.
Is there further debate on the motion? Good lady from 35.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, excuse me. I really appreciate our law enforcement officers, the good ladies and gentlemen of this body, others who have had protests at their home. I don't want to protest at my home, however. So in our Constitution, I'll just remind us that it says in Section 10, the right of assembly. The people shall have the right to assemble in a peaceable manner, to consult for their common good, to instruct their representatives, and to petition the legislature for the redress of grievances. And then, of course, in our U.S. Constitution, Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And I also believe that our Constitution was made, someone has said this in the past, was made only for a moral and religious people, and it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So I'm not willing to give up on our constitutional rights and the people that we represent. And so for that reason, and for others also, but I'm not going to go on, I will be voting no on this. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Hearing none. Gentleman from 20.
Mr. Speaker, I did not want to debate on this bill. I especially don't want to give negative debate on this bill. I find myself in a tough situation on this one. I wouldn't want anybody to think that in any way I don't support law enforcement in any way. I think in the 13 years I've been here, I've debated against people's bills maybe 3 or 4 times. I'm not a lawyer, obviously. I don't have the ability to speak clearly and comfortably as I stand here before you. And it makes me really uncomfortable, especially on this issue. Do I think it's okay for people to come and picket in front of our homes, in front of policemen's homes? No, I don't think it's okay. I don't think they should do that. I don't think it's the right way to handle things. Yet we have this bill before us. A bill that I think is the wrong thing to do at this time. Many of you know my background and where I came from and who I was raised by. A mile and a half down the road from this building, as we sit, I was 6 years old a gang, the only gang at the time, and there was gangs back then, they were tough, came before our house, 28 of them, lined up in front of my house. My dad worked for Boise City Police. He was the sergeant, head over vice and narcotics. They lined up in front of our house. The reason they lined up in front of our house was to come and make the threat that they were going to kill our family and blow up our house. 6-year-old. My dad met him in the street. Him and a friend of his, a horseshoer. They were shoeing our horse in our backyard. In case you wonder this is, you know where Manitou Park is down the street? That was our pasture at the time. The house in the middle of the park, that was the house. They lined up to make this threat. They met in the street. Words were exchanged. Probably a little more colorful than we would accept these days. My father had a way of speaking that got people's attention. We'll say that. As this was transpiring, me and my friends were in the window of our bedroom looking out, watching it. I was actually in the front yard when they all pulled up, and I ran out back and said, "Dad." And I explained to him who was pulling up, and I won't use the term that we used back then because now everything's all politically incorrect. You can't say anything anymore. We're going to offend somebody. I'm probably going to offend some people here today. He went out and met him, and we watched out the window, and here's my dad out there. He's my hero. Met them in the street and faced them down face to face, and they had the conversation, and within minutes, Boise police came from every direction, and they dealt with it. They arrested those that needed to be arrested. They moved along. They broke it up. That was the end of it. Life went on. That was just the first time. Multiple times that's happened to me throughout my life. Sometimes since I've had people picketing my business. I've had death threats in this building. Just a few weeks ago, I had every call you can imagine that was terrible coming to my wife and to me and all the things that went on downstairs because of the way I called the vote on a bill. We put ourselves into this position, this job, and we make decisions that are tough. And do we deserve to be ridiculed over it? No. But we need to be careful. We need to do our best to slow things down and make good decisions legislatively, good decisions in our speech. We all make mistakes. I make them every few minutes. We need to just be very careful, thoughtful, methodical, and try and not make things worse. We need to do our best to do our job and do what we know is the right thing to do. And I'm going to ask you to vote no on this bill. And I have law enforcement friends on both sides of this issue, and some of them won't be happy with me over this. I respect that Constitution. I respect this body. I respect this building. I respect the people that are bringing this piece of legislation. I just think that in this day, this piece of legislation needs to, I wish we weren't even hearing it, actually. I think just the fact that we're hearing it, the fact that we're up here talking, may stir things up, and I hope that doesn't happen. And I would ask those that are listening to me that agree with me to not do that, to do things the right way, to come down here and to talk to us. You know our phone numbers. You know you can come and talk to us, and I know you're frustrated, and I understand your frustration. I'm frustrated too. The reason I'm here is because I was frustrated, so I ran for this job in the first place. Let's just try and take that into consideration, that we all have jobs to do, and we want to do the right thing. And I hope that we can move past this day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Is there further debate? Good gentleman from 30.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good ladies and gentlemen of the House, I'm going to try and speak as honestly and clearly as I can. I'm going to try and give you some reasons why you can vote for this bill. The right of free speech and the right of assembly are not absolutes. Never have been. Our founding generation believed that freedom of speech and the right to assemble and petition the government, these are political rights. They give us the right to do those things without the threat of revenge on the part of the government. But they are not absolute, not in the least way. The good lady from 35's quoted some of the Constitution. I won't repeat that. I will read to you Section 9 of Article 1 of the Idaho Constitution. It says, "Every person may freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, being responsible for the abuse of that liberty." There are ways, good ladies and gentlemen, that we can abuse our liberties and our rights and our freedoms. With that last statement in mind, let me speak about another concept underpinning rule of law in our country. It's true that we do have to have law to restrain the behavior of some people. But if we want to remain a free society, then we must embrace freely and willingly the responsibility and accept the idea that most restraint in a free society must be self-imposed. I believe sincerely and honestly that demonstrating, picketing in front of a private residence is wrong. It's inherently wrong. It has been done very seldomly in this country. I can't hardly remember one instance of it in my life, and I'm an old man. People don't do it because they inherently understand that it's wrong. There are principles of decency and moral behavior that should be at play in our society. Do to others as you would have them do to you was one of the most quoted phrases during the revolutionary period of America's history. The right of free speech and the right of assembly are not absolutes, as I've said before. They cannot be used in any situation, under any circumstance, without limits and without restraint. You've all heard you can't yell fire in a crowded auditorium. You can't slander someone or assault them verbally. It is not right to do so, and we have also made laws which make it illegal to do so. We do not like to make numerous laws. In a free society, we need as few laws as is possible. But there are many rights that we have that are balanced with other rights. Even the right of property is balanced with the right of eminent domain, which means that the government can take your property with just compensation for public use. If I go back to the Idaho Constitution, all men are by nature, this is Section 1, Article 1, very first part of our Constitution. All men are by nature free and equal and have certain inalienable rights, among which are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, pursuing happiness, and securing safety. The sacredness of a person's property and home is enshrined in our constitutional system. Amendments 3 and 4 of the U.S. Constitution, one protecting us against unlawful quartering of troops in our homes, and one protecting us against unreasonable searches and seizures, has been used, those two have been used by the United States Supreme Court to give us a broader concept of liberty, freedom, security in our homes. The founders used to say, a home is a man's castle. So, given what I've shared with you, I think it's reasonable and logical to conclude that the right to be safe and secure in a person's home weighs more heavily in this scale of liberty than the right of speech and assembly. It is reasonable and logical to believe that. I think that you can see that it is wrong to intimidate citizens in their homes, to threaten or bully them in that space where safety and security is most prized. It certainly is wrong to threaten their family, their spouse, their children, or any other person in their home. And it's wrong to assemble and threaten their neighbors and their friends. These are opposing rights, this right to be secure and safe in our home, and this right of speech and assembly. The right of speech and assembly is not taken away if you pass this bill. This bill is not unconstitutional. It is the right of this legislature, in some cases, to define something as wrong and make it illegal. If the people of the United States and if the people of Idaho will not accept any longer the fact that it is wrong to come to a person's home, that sacred space of privacy, if the people of Idaho will no longer accept that as a responsibility on their part, an abuse of their liberty, then this legislature has the right to make that action illegal. We will not take away the right of free speech or assembly. That right is very broad. People can come to this place and say just about anything they darn well please. They can assemble in any public square throughout this city. They may even have the right to march down a street in a residential area. I'm not sure. But to stop and harass a family, a person in their private home is wrong. And because it's wrong, and because people have come to that in their behavior, it is certainly the right of this legislature to make that behavior illegal. Again, this bill isn't perfect, but it is not unconstitutional. People still have the right to peaceably assemble, to petition the government for redress of grievances. They have the right to free speech and freedom of the press, as the U.S. Constitution makes clear, to freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, being responsible for the abuse of that liberty, as the Idaho Constitution makes clear. The rights of speech and assembly do not have to be given free rein in a quiet residential area in front of a private residence to continue as sacred constitutional rights that are practiced and honored. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask everyone in this House to reconsider where you might be and understand that the time right now to make an action illegal, which we have always accepted as wrong, is the right time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, good gentlemen. Is there further debate? Good lady from 31.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been some very thoughtful and heartfelt discussion, and I appreciate that. I would like to speak in opposition to this legislation. Thank you. We protect constitutional rights as a legislature by ensuring that the laws that we write are very clear and concise. And one of the things that I have struggled with as we have dealt with this particular piece of legislation and this particular issue is the lack of clarity and definition in the legislation. So I would like to refer to the bill at hand, but may I also ask Mr. Speaker for permission to also refer to some existing statutes in my comments?
You do not need to ask permission to read statutes. So you're
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill adds a new penalty for an activity called picketing. And I've searched in vain for a definition of picketing anywhere in our statutes. The bill references not only picketing, but otherwise demonstrating. I don't know what otherwise demonstrating means, but it implies that I disagree with someone and I'm trying to tell them something in some way, and that's all I know. In committee, it was suggested that if there was not an existing legal definition for picketing, that the courts would likely go to the dictionary definition of picketing. So I looked that up, and I found a lot of references to boards that you build fences out of. But I think the definition that seemed the most applicable and came up first on Google is on your desk. And if I may read that, Mr. Speaker, do I need to ask permission to read that?
You do on that one. Unanimous consent has been requested to read the definition. Is there objection? Hearing none, the lady may read.
Thank you. This is from the legal dictionary, the free dictionary, and it says in part, picketing is standing or parading near a business or a government office, usually with signs of protest or claims in labor disputes or public policy controversies. Picketing is constitutionally guaranteed as free speech, but in some cases it may be limited by a court order to prevent physical combat, blocking of entrances, or threats to public safety. So this is the top definition I was able to find for picketing. And the verbs here are standing or parading. Now, as I've thought about this idea of not all speech or assembly may be constitutionally protected. We understand some of the limits that have been placed on speech. As I think about assembly, I think that one very important word is in our Constitution, peaceable assembly. And as I look at our existing statute that I believe would cover the vast majority of the situations we heard discussed in committee, this statute is addressing behavior which is not peaceable. Loud or unusual noise, tumultuous or offensive conduct, threatening. We've heard a lot about threatening. Traducing, which is to lie or to speak ill of someone. Quarreling, challenging to fight or fighting, etc. These are not peaceable activities, and they are already prohibited in our existing statute. And I think most of us agree those behaviors are objectionable. My concern is that this bill could capture as illegal an activity that is entirely peaceable, standing in the street, if the person that is charging you with that activity perceives that your intent is to harass, annoy, or intimidate. Beyond that, I have a concern that this bill uses the word person in a couple of different contexts. So you'll see that you're intending to annoy a person, or that you're in front of a person's residence, actually, that comes first, and that you intend to annoy another person, which to me leads me to believe that it doesn't really matter whose residence you're standing in front of. It may not even be the person that you intend to send your message to, but you are in front of someone's residence or in front of a residence next to someone, and you intend to annoy someone. If we're going to criminalize speech or assembly, we need to be very careful that we've identified what it is that's criminal and that we're justified in that action. It has been said that we have a right to be secure in our homes, and I agree. We have a right to be secure, but we don't have a right to always feel secure or to never have anyone make us uncomfortable because they disagree with us. I'm not willing to go that far in terms of what's acceptable. So, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that we have good laws in place. I understand that there are behaviors that may be unacceptable. And if they are not peaceable assembly, by all means, bring me the bill and I will support it. But I am concerned that this bill in its language captures activities that should be protected and should not be violated. And for that reason, I will be opposing this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, good ladies. Is there further debate? Good gentleman from 31.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to debate in favor of this bill. I'd like to make 4 points that support my decision to support this bill. First, the bill is constitutional. I'm a defense attorney. I deal in protecting people's constitutional rights. For 6 years, I was a volunteer with the high school We the People team in Blackfoot, Idaho. As a volunteer, I was the mentor for the Bill of Rights unit and had the opportunity to work with kids in looking at rights protected by the Bill of Rights. If I felt like this bill was unconstitutional, I want you to know that I would not support it. It is constitutional. As has been pointed out, constitutional rights, even those that are explicitly stated in absolute terms, are not absolute. There is a long line of examples of what we call time, place, and manner restrictions on those rights. This bill presents an example of a narrowly tailored approach which presents a time, place, and manner restriction on assembly and or speech. It is constitutional. 2, I believe that not passing this bill would have unintended consequences. And in this context, I'm talking about the consequences for elected officials. Those who oppose this bill do so because they don't want to quiet a class of people from having their say. I think that
The gentleman continue.
Thank you. I believe that not passing this bill will result in a weeding out of people who are willing to run for office, a division between what I call the elites, who might have the ability to fence off, wall off, separate themselves from the protesters, compared to those who don't have that ability. And I think that that's an unintended consequence that we should consider and that we should avoid. Number 3, targeted residential picketing is just simply unfair. It's unfair because it leverages the power that somebody can have over somebody else by putting in danger and or threatening and or causing undue stress to that person's spouse and or children. And that is not a fair tactic, and we should not put up with it. And finally, it wasn't too long ago that across this country, we all looked at our law enforcement men and women with respect and with pride. If you would have told me that we would have advanced to where we are in today's society with lots of areas where law enforcement men and women are looked at with scorn, I would not have believed you. But here we are. We need to support our men and women in law enforcement, this bill is a good way to show that support, to show them that they have a place of refuge from the criticism and protests and threats that they endure on a daily basis for us. I will be supporting our law enforcement. I will be supporting this bill, and I urge everyone to do so as well. Thank you.
Thank you, good gentlemen. Further debate. Good lady from 5.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been a great debate, and I truly appreciate all the citizens who came and shared their perspective. I think all the sleepless nights that our committee had over this very difficult issue. I think the sanctity of a person's home was understood by our founders, and it was the foundation of and those rights were the foundation of all the laws that have come since. As you know, only as a republic can the rights of an individual be protected. And we're talking about the rights of an individual. Our homes are sacred, and the Constitution clearly laid out that no one can come in without our invitation or without a court-ordered search warrant or on some very limited purposes, such as if your house is on fire. And the Idaho legislature has done a lot since I've been here, and I've proudly voted for those bills. I voted for those bills that strengthen our trespass laws. I voted for those bills that strengthen our stand your ground laws. And I voted for those bills that bring the Castle Doctrine more firmly into the Idaho Code. But what we've set up is a clashing of rights between the right for us to have a peaceful home and protect our property and the rights of our citizens to assemble and address their redresses or have their concerns addressed by their politicians and by others, by their representatives. These clashing rights are a dangerous place to be, and we've set that up. And I think it's our responsibility as a legislature to make sure that we don't create something much worse than we've had to date. I also wanted to mention that in the definition of picketing, it didn't include homes. And we're talking about somebody's home, and my home is my castle. And with that, I ask for your green light.
Thank you, good lady. Is there further debate? Good lady from 15.
To debate against the bill.
Lady has the floor.
I cannot accept the premise that this protects our police officers. I want to stand with our police officers, but I do not think that this bill protects them any more than the current statute, and I think it exacerbates the problem. I'll be voting against it because I expect Idahoans to act responsibly, and I hope that they will choose not to do things that would cause problems, but I don't think legislating it solves the problem.
Good lady, is there further debate? Lady from 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to debate against the bill. This is not a law enforcement bill. This is a free speech bill. And how did we get to this position that we're in? Well, in my mind, we got to this position because we have shut down the places where the government resides for the people to be able to even come and protest it. People have not been working in those buildings. They've been working at their homes, and they've been using the internet and other services to communicate. So they haven't even been at the locations for people to be able to come and peacefully protest. So what are the people supposed to do? It's been very aggravating, and I have talked to many of these people. I've even joined with them at the different locations to be able to talk with them while they're protesting. And they keep coming to me at that time and asking, what are we supposed to do? We can't even get into the building. We can't even go and talk to these people. They're not even listening to us. So what alternative are they given? So I ask, at these places that were mentioned where targeted picketing may have occurred, were the police even called to these locations? Were the police there? Well, one I know for sure was a policeman's home, and I know there were other policemen there, I don't believe any arrests were ever made. We do have laws on the books already to cover a lot of this stuff. And so why are we going to add more law? I see this as that we're starting to create, if we pass this, that we're going to start creating free speech zones. And that is very anti-First Amendment. I really feel that if we pass this, that it's going to create even more problems, and the citizens of this state are going to look upon us that we are trying to protect ourselves and that we are trying to eliminate their ability to address their grievances with their government. And so for that point, I cannot support this. I also want to say that I do not support protesting at people's homes. I would never do that myself. But I don't believe that this is the right way to handle this, and I think it's just going to create further problems. And so I will not be supporting this. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Hearing none. Gentleman from 9.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from 9.
I'd like to briefly give some of my thoughts on the role of government when people under them are being threatened or intimidated or harassed in a place where they should be safe. When I was a teacher for 2 decades, kids mess around a little bit, you look the other way. But when they start harassing and intimidating other kids and make them wish they weren't there or make it where they can't learn, I was the government. They can't do that. Okay, you have to do whatever you have to do to make sure that that is a safe place and that they want to come to school every day. When I became an administrator for a couple of decades, I had to do the same thing with teachers and parents and kids. Some teachers would want to intimidate the kids. No, you can't do that. Parents would come in yelling mad and so forth. Parents would yell and scream back at them. No. Civil discourse. Otherwise, the parents, the teachers, and the kids do not want to be in my school, and it's not going to be a productive environment. So I see this bill as keeping our policemen, our deputy sheriffs, school board members, our county commissioners, city councils, mayors, and so forth safe in their homes. If we don't do that, people are not going to be as interested in participating in any kind of a position where they are going to be harassed for their decisions. And to have a productive society, we need this to stop. So I'd really encourage your green light. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Good gentleman from 29.
Mr. Speaker, just to touch on one issue that hasn't been brought up. Sometimes it's okay to tell our supporters hard truths. And I'm not sure that the supporters or the people who have come to debate against this bill, who believe that their rights of free speech are being infringed by this bill, have been told those hard truths. And the hard truth is this: the right to participate in a constitutional republic, the right to be heard, does not mean you always get what you want. I know that. There's lots of things I would like to have happen in this body. There's lots of things that my supporters would like to see happen in this body. I don't get that. But I get to be heard. All of you are kind enough to listen to my debates, to listen to my ideas about bills. That's how this process works. Just because you don't get what you want does not mean you haven't been heard. Just because you don't get what you want does not mean you didn't have an opportunity as a citizen in this nation and in this state to have your elected officials consider your opinions. Sometimes your opinions get rejected, and it can be for all kinds of reasons, as we know in this body. But you still had your opportunity to be heard. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Good gentleman from 32.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make a point that the Constitution is not full of political rights. It is there to protect God-given rights. I heard that earlier from a gentleman. Also, in the opening debate, we heard the word hostage. I'm not aware of any situations in the news where there was a hostage situation. I'm just not. As it was stated before, there's laws in the books to deal with this. A good gentleman once said, a founding father said, that he'd rather be exposed to too many inconveniences of liberty than the opposite. Thomas Jefferson. I understand these inconveniences are very trying, uncomfortable. That's the cost of liberty. In fact, these people that demonstrated at these places, I spoke to a few of them and said I didn't like what they did. I wouldn't agree with it. But that's not cause for this kind of a bill. As mentioned earlier, I had a point to make about this will create free speech zones. Absolutely. You can't have a protest here on the sidewalk. What's next? You're opening Pandora's box here. My constituents asked me to come here and fight for liberty and push it that direction, not the opposite way. So I'll be voting no again on this bill. Thank you.
Is there further debate? Lady from 14.
Mr. Speaker, to debate against the bill. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, my mom's heart was moved when we watched protests that happened this summer and fall. But the personal rights of those that we have come here to represent may oppose the things that we do, the things that we say as we execute our duties while we are here, or those that other elected officials. But it is our utmost duty to protect the rights of those that have elected us to be here. And so for that reason, I will be opposing this bill.
Is there further debate? Hearing none? You're wishing I'd have came back sooner, right? Then the gentleman from District 10 is recognized to close the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the House, for this debate. Irrespective of how the vote goes, this will be a good one for your social studies teachers to play back for their students. It's one of those. I'd like to address some of the comments here today. Again, not to be redundant, but as some of the good gentlemen from 30 and 31 both pointed out, this isn't unconstitutional. Justice Scalia joined in the decision. I would put Justice Scalia's conservative credentials up against anybody. The good gentleman from 20 mentioned businesses getting targeted. I wanted to specifically point out that businesses are still free game. That we put ourselves in this position, and I guess I would agree with that, but I do not agree with the notion that we put our children and our families in this position. I do not agree that fear for them should be what motivates my vote, or fear for them should be what motivates an officer's arrest decision or deadly force decision. Comments were made that we should be methodical. This was brought as a bipartisan bill specifically to absorb daggers from both ends of the spectrum and was vetted extensively. I recognize the frustrations that were brought up, but this bill in no way makes a value judgment on the underlying frustrations that either the left or the right have expressed through their acts of targeted picketing. Good gentleman from 30 made a good point, and it seems to book in nicely with the comments from the gentleman from 32 and the good lady from 11. What if I told you there were already free speech zones? If you were to, here in the People's House, use the restroom, close the stall door, and go about whatever it is you needed to go about with, and somebody kicked open the door and said, I have an absolute right to be here and protest right here, right in front of you, you would recognize that there are certain places, certain zones that just are going too far. This doesn't prohibit picketing. This doesn't prohibit expression. It asks it to move it down the block a little ways. There are hundreds of places where you can protest. There's only one where you can be at home. As far as the language of the bill, picketing has a clear definition. Existing statute does not cover it. The Idaho Prosecuting Attorneys Association wholeheartedly endorses it, as the good lady, my co-sponsor, mentioned in her opening. As far as whose residence it refers to, I don't expect anybody, picketer or police alike, to check the county recorder's office or the tax rolls to see who's on the title of a given piece of property before engaging or not engaging in particular behaviors. Again, this is an Arizona statute that has been in effect for almost 30 years and been upheld for 25. Good lady from 15 said that this doesn't protect police. As the good lady from 18 mentioned in her opening, the Idaho Sheriff's Association, the Idaho Chiefs of Police Association, and the Fraternal Order of Police seem to disagree, as do the spouses of law enforcement that have reached out over the course of the last several days. Heard it said that this was done because they were shut out of places to protest. Well, now our open meeting law requires that there be a physical presence if there's going to be a virtual meeting, and the fact that that was not followed is of no small consequence, but it's a consequence that we're addressing otherwise. But I would submit this. Again, this bill was not introduced, nor do I advance it because of what happened to me and my family. But it does give me a little bit of firsthand experience to draw on. Nearly every person outside of my home had testified in our committee that very same day. I had been in this building, this public forum, to be protested for somewhere in the vicinity of 50 days before it happened. And again, it's not about the underlying grievance, it's about the underlying behavior. As to whether or not there are hostages, the good lady from 18 qualified her comments earlier by pointing out that feeling like you can't leave, and she recognized it wasn't a true hostage situation. But you know, like the good gentleman from 20 pointed out, I'm sure that that's not the feeling of everybody. When you invade the family, you have younger eyes that see that you're going to have to go out, if at all, through an angry crowd, to go down the street to play with the neighbor kid, to go to the grocery store, to go for a bike ride. It feels like being held hostage. And finally, before I yield to the good lady from 18, I would like to point out that if you were to open your blinds tonight and see a crowd perfectly silent staring at your house, I would submit that that would be more, not less, intimidating to you than a loud and boisterous crowd. It would seem eerie. And that has happened. That has happened here in this city, in this state, as a means of standing in the gap between trespass law and disturbing the peace. And it is that area that this legislation seeks to address. I would yield the remainder of my close to the good lady from 18, if she will yield.
Thank you, good gentleman. Will the lady yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, Lady Lee.
You have the floor to finish the closing debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good body. We have, and we recognize we've put you in a really precarious position where you're going to have to find the courage and the strength to make a vote that is probably very unpopular for one group and very supported by another. I also recognize the good gentleman from District 20. Believe me, I didn't want you to have to be in that position to get up to testify against this. I recognize childhood experiences are deep. We all have the memories. But it's also in that discussion that highlights that what we do and what happens in front of our homes, what is holding our families in their homes, isn't victimless. That the children who are in those homes are going to remember. They're going to reflect back on that into their adulthood. They're going to recognize the fear, either the fear of the mom who's holding them tight, trying to recognize that this isn't something she wants her children to see, or the father who is just coming home, who is now being judged outside of his house for simply doing his job. We don't want those memories, and we certainly don't want them for our children. Today's debate was rich, very purposeful discussion. It highlighted fairness, civil discourse, First Amendment. It also highlighted something we all hold very true, and that is our personal space and our property. It was brought up that this isn't necessarily for law enforcement. I take great offense to that. You want to know why? I highlighted in my opening statement. I am a spouse of a law enforcement officer. I know what it has to be to keep your head on a swivel because your husband is just simply doing his job. I know what it feels like to have to come home, close the blinds because he simply did his job. I don't have children, but I guarantee you the other spouses on his team who did have children, I know what it felt and what they communicated when they have to leave their homes for fear of their husbands simply doing their job. So while you may not want to recognize this isn't for law enforcement or spin it what the media has spun it to be, just a protection for us, well, I hold in hand and what's on your desk, 4 letters from agencies who support our law enforcement, Fraternal Order Police, Sheriff's Association, prosecutors, chiefs of police. If this wasn't for their brothers in blue, if this wasn't to provide additional teeth for them to do their jobs, why would they be supporting this? If the laws in the books were already good enough, why would they help in supporting this and bringing it forward? This is a bipartisan issue because what's unfolding across the United States and here in Idaho, it's coming from both sides, guys. It's the left, it's the right, and they're taking it to your doorstep. So while you sit here and reflect how you're going to vote, I want to encourage you, whatever courage there is, to find it in you to vote with those who we support, those families who serve our families every day, and recognize this is very much for law enforcement as it is for all of our community members. No one, under no circumstances, should be afraid to go home and, yes, be captive in their homes. Because if they can't go anywhere else but their home, or they're forced to run out of their home, then they are captive. And they should find the comfort in their homes and tuck their children away into bed at night, knowing their home is safe. So with that, I leave you with this. Those who support us, and Mr. Speaker, can I quote a document?
Without objection, the lady may.
I'll leave you with this from the Fraternal Order of Police on your desk. When the demonstrators are finished and the media has gone home, our families, because I get to say that, we're the visible target for those who would like to seek to do us harm. Because the reality is, we are the target for simply doing our jobs. And I'd ask for your green light in support of this and in support of our law enforcement officers and their families.
Thank you. Debate is closed. The question before us is, shall House Bill number 195 pass the House? The clerk will unlock the machine and the members will record their votes. Has every member voted? They have. Does any member wish to change his vote? The clerk will lock the machine and read the pairs.
Harris votes nay. Nekochev votes aye. Andrus votes nay. Syme votes aye.
The vote count shows 31 in favor with 38 against and 1 absent. House Bill number 195 has failed to pass the House and be retained in the office of the Chief Clerk.